Fire bases were some of the most dangerous places to serve during the Vietnam War. These isolated outposts sat deep in enemy territory, surrounded by dense jungle and an enemy that was always watching. Their main purpose was to provide constant artillery support for infantry operations, but they also served as strongholds to control territory and launch patrols. Unlike traditional battlefields with clear front lines, Vietnam's war zones were unpredictable. Fire bases had to be heavily fortified, constantly supplied by air, and defended against relentless attacks. Soldiers stationed there lived with the constant threat of mortar fire, surprise infiltrations, and large-scale enemy assaults. In this video, we'll explore how these fire bases were built, their role in battle, and the brutal conditions soldiers faced while serving on them. We'll also dive into the devastating attack on Firebase Marianne, where enemy sappers infiltrated and overran the base in a surprise night assault. By the end, you'll understand why these isolated bases were so critical to U.S. strategy and why they were some of the most terrifying places to serve during the Vietnam War. Fire bases, also known as fire support bases, were heavily fortified military outposts used by the U.S. Army and Marines during the Vietnam War. Their primary function was to provide continuous artillery support for infantry operations in surrounding areas. Because Vietnam had no clear front lines, these bases were strategically placed deep in enemy territory to help control land, support missions, and maintain a U.S. presence. Fire bases were often positioned on hilltops, ridges, or clear jungle areas, allowing artillery to fire in all directions. They acted as military strongholds, similar to medieval forts, giving U.S. forces a base from which to launch patrols and monitor enemy movements. These bases weren't just artillery hubs. They also served as supply points, evacuation sites, and coordination centers for military operations. Some were small and temporary, built for a few weeks before being abandoned. Others, like Firebase Ripcord or Khe Sanh, were large and heavily defended for long-term operations. However, being stationed on a firebase was dangerous. Soldiers faced constant threats from enemy fire, sabotage, and full-scale assaults. Cut off from the rest of the force, fire bases operated like isolated islands in a sea of hostile jungle, relying entirely on helicopters for supplies and reinforcements. In the next section, we'll explore why fire bases were so critical in Vietnam and why they were built in such dangerous locations. The U.S. military relied heavily on air power during the Vietnam War, using helicopters and bombers to transport troops, strike enemy positions, and provide fire support. However, air support had one major weakness: it wasn't always available. Bad weather, limited fuel, or other operations could prevent aircraft from reaching soldiers in time. That's where fire bases came in. Fire bases provided 24/7 artillery support, regardless of weather or time of day. Since ground troops often operated deep in enemy territory, they needed fire support that was always available. Artillery was essential for defending positions, repelling enemy attacks, and supporting infantry patrols in the surrounding areas. Vietnam's landscape made traditional warfare impossible. There were no clear front lines like in previous wars. Instead, the enemy moved through dense jungles, using guerrilla tactics to attack and disappear. This meant fire bases had to be spread out across South Vietnam, acting as defensive hubs and controlling key areas. However, placing these bases deep in enemy-controlled areas made them extremely vulnerable. Fire bases had to be self-sufficient, relying on air resupply since most roads were too dangerous due to ambushes. Enemy forces constantly watched these outposts, waiting for weaknesses to strike. Instead of advancing in a straight line, as in traditional warfare, U.S. forces used leapfrogging tactics. They would build a fire base, use it to launch missions and control an area, then move forward to establish a new fire base deeper into enemy territory. This strategy allowed the U.S. to maintain pressure on the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese Army, NVA. Despite their importance, fire bases were not safe. They were frequent targets of mortar attacks, night infiltrations, and large-scale assaults. Some bases held out against repeated attacks, while others were overrun and abandoned. In the next section, we'll look at how these fire bases were built and fortified to withstand constant threats. Building a fire base in Vietnam was a fast but dangerous process. Because these bases were deep in enemy territory, soldiers had to construct defenses as quickly as possible while staying alert for attacks. Before building a firebase, commanders had to select a strategic location. The site needed to be high enough to give a clear line of sight for artillery and defense, close enough to support infantry units in the region, accessible by helicopters for resupply and evacuation. Once the location was chosen, construction began immediately, often within hours of arrival. Since fire bases were usually built in dense jungle, the first step was clearing vegetation. This was done using bulldozers to push down trees and clear paths, explosives to remove large obstacles, napalm or herbicides like Agent Orange to destroy thick vegetation. Clearing a wide area was critical for defense. The enemy relied on jungle cover to launch surprise attacks, so exposing the surrounding terrain gave defenders a clear field of fire. Once the area was cleared, defensive perimeters were set up. 1. Barbed wire barriers to slow enemy movements. 2. Mines and booby traps to deter infiltrators. 3rd. Bunkers and trenches made from sandbags and reinforced with wooden planks or steel. Artillery guns were positioned before nightfall to ensure the base could defend itself immediately. Fire bases functioned as self-sufficient outposts. Each day included artillery fire missions to support ground troops, patrols to detect enemy movement and set traps, supply drops by helicopter with food, ammo, and water. Despite these precautions, fire bases remained vulnerable to attack. The enemy studied their weaknesses and waited for the right moment to strike. In the next section, we'll examine the powerful weapons and artillery that made fire bases such deadly strongholds. Fire bases were built around artillery, the most important weapon for defending troops and supporting operations in the field. These bases housed powerful guns capable of delivering devastating firepower across long distances, making them critical for the U.S. military strategy in Vietnam. The primary weapons used in fire bases were 105mm howitzers, the most common artillery piece, known for its rapid fire and effectiveness against infantry and light fortifications. 155mm howitzers, larger and more powerful, capable of delivering long-range fire missions. 8-inch howitzers, used in some bases for extreme-range precision strikes. These artillery pieces fired different types of shells, including high-explosive, HE, used for general destruction of enemy positions. Smoke rounds, to mark targets or obscure enemy vision. Illumination rounds, fired at night to light up enemy movement. Beehive rounds, anti-personnel rounds that fired thousands of steel darts, devastating enemy troops at close range. Fire bases positioned their guns to maximize coverage. Star formation, used in larger bases, with 5 guns at the points and 1 in the center for all-around fire support. Triangle or diamond formations, used in smaller bases, ensuring no blind spots. To defend against close-range attacks, fire bases sometimes used a special artillery technique. Killer Jr., a time-fused shell detonated about 30 feet above the ground, scattering deadly shrapnel over a wide area. Killer Sr., a more powerful version using 8-inch howitzers for massive destruction. Alongside artillery, fire bases had mortars, 60mm and 81mm, for short-range fire, recoilless rifles for anti-armor roles, machine guns, M60s and M2.50 cals, for perimeter defense. Despite this firepower, fire bases were still vulnerable. In the next section, we'll see how these bases were fortified against relentless enemy attacks. Fire bases were heavily fortified to protect against enemy attacks. But no defense was perfect. The enemy studied weak points and constantly tested their strength, making security a never-ending challenge for soldiers stationed there. A firebase's perimeter was designed to slow down and inflict heavy casualties on attacking forces before they could reach the main defenses. Layers of protection included barbed wire fences. Thick rows of barbed wire encircled the base to block enemy movement. Tripwires with flares or grenades triggered alarms or explosions when disturbed, alerting defenders to enemy infiltration. Claymore mines, directional explosives that could be manually or automatically triggered to blast enemy troops. Beyond these physical barriers, fire bases also had booby traps and early warning systems to detect approaching forces. Constant vigilance was key to survival. Fire bases relied on Observation towers, manned around the clock for spotting enemy movements. Listening posts, LPs, small outposts just outside the base, where soldiers monitored enemy activity at night. Ground surveillance radars, used in some bases to detect movement in dense jungle. Night vision, starlight scopes, early infrared devices used to see in the dark. Patrols were frequently sent beyond the perimeter to check for signs of enemy activity and set up ambush points. But these missions were incredibly dangerous. The jungle surrounding fire bases was often laced with enemy booby traps, causing many casualties. Despite these layers of security, fire bases still faced deadly assaults. In the next section, we'll examine the enemy's tactics and how they found ways to breach these defenses. Despite their fortifications, fire bases were never completely safe. The North Vietnamese Army, NVA, and Viet Cong, VC, constantly studied their weaknesses, using sappers, artillery, and ambush tactics to attack when defenders least expected it. One of the biggest threats came from sappers, highly trained enemy commandos who specialized in stealth attacks. They moved silently through the jungle, cutting through barbed wire and minefields without being detected. Once inside, they threw explosives into bunkers, destroying ammunition depots and artillery positions. Their attacks were often timed with mortar barrages, creating chaos and confusion before a larger assault. Sapper infiltrations were especially dangerous at night when visibility was low. A well-coordinated attack could leave an entire firebase in ruins within minutes. Enemy forces also used long-range artillery and mortars to weaken firebases before launching ground attacks. Soviet M46 130mm field guns had an effective range of 17 miles, often outranging U.S. artillery. Mortars and recoilless rifles could be set up quickly, fired, and relocated before American forces could return fire. The enemy targeted ammo depots, fuel storage, and command posts, hoping for catastrophic explosions. The NVA didn't always attack directly. Instead, they used guerrilla tactics to set booby traps and landmines around firebases to kill patrols and supply teams, fire sporadic mortar rounds to keep soldiers on edge and deprive them of sleep, intercept radio signals to predict supply drops and reinforcements. Despite their best defenses, some firebases fell. In the next section, we'll cover one of the most devastating firebase overruns, the attack on Firebase Marianne. One of the most devastating firebase overruns of the Vietnam War took place on March 27, 1971, at Firebase Marianne. What started as a quiet night quickly turned into a deadly ambush when North Vietnamese sappers infiltrated the base, launching a surprise attack that left dozens of American soldiers dead or wounded. By early 1971, U.S. forces were preparing to hand over Firebase Marianne to the South Vietnamese Army, ARVN. Enemy activity in the area had been minimal, leading to complacency among the American defenders. Many of the base's defensive measures had been neglected or poorly maintained. Barbed wire fences had gaps, making infiltration easier. Tripwires and mines were not properly checked, reducing early warning defenses. Guards were less vigilant, believing an attack was unlikely. The North Vietnamese Army, NVA, saw these weaknesses and planned a stealth assault using sappers, elite commandos, trained in infiltration and sabotage. Around 2:30 a.m., a 50-man NVA sapper team moved in complete silence through the jungle toward the firebase. These highly trained soldiers carried no firearms to avoid making noise. Instead, they were armed with wire cutters to breach defensive barriers, satchel charges, explosive bags, to destroy bunkers, grenades and tear gas to create chaos, knives and pistols for silent kills. Moving undetected, they cut through 3 layers of barbed wire and slipped past defensive positions, getting as close as 20 meters to the sleeping soldiers before launching their assault. The first wave of the attack began when NVA mortars opened fire, bombarding key locations inside the base. As explosions rocked the firebase, sappers rushed in. Satchel charges were thrown into bunkers, instantly killing soldiers inside. The command post was hit early, killing several officers and crippling communication. Artillery crews were ambushed, preventing the defenders from using their own guns. Tear gas and smoke filled the air, blinding defenders and adding to the confusion. Some soldiers fought back, but without a clear chain of command, the response was disorganized. The final toll of the attack was 33 Americans killed and 83 wounded, one of the worst firebase overruns of the war. The attack on Firebase Marianne was a clear example of how dangerous and vulnerable firebases could be. Even with fortifications, a determined enemy with the element of surprise could wipe out an entire outpost in a single night. This was just one of many firebase battles in Vietnam. Some outposts held out, while others fell. In the next section, we'll reflect on why these bases were both critical and deadly in the Vietnam War. Fire bases were a key part of U.S. military strategy in the Vietnam War, providing constant artillery support in a stronghold in hostile territory. However, their isolation made them extremely vulnerable to attacks. Soldiers stationed on these bases faced daily threats, from mortar barrages and surprise infiltrations to full-scale assaults. The attack on Firebase Marianne was a harsh reminder of these dangers. Despite its defenses, a well-planned enemy assault resulted in heavy casualties and devastation. Similar attacks happened at other firebases, proving that no outpost was truly safe. Yet firebases remained a critical part of the war effort. Without them, infantry units operating in remote areas would have had no artillery support, no secure supply points, and no defensive strongholds. The bravery of the men who served in these isolated bases should never be forgotten. Thank you for watching. If you found this video informative, please consider liking and subscribing for more content on military history. Let us know in the comments which battles or topics you'd like us to cover next. See you in the next video.